So, welcome back to the Introduction to Evangelism course. We will now focus on the last model of evangelism called the media model. You could also today call this the internet model, the social media model, anything that's going to have some sort of modern technology in which we're going to use as a communication tool to make sure that the gospel can reach as many people as possible. And this model in particular is about reach more so than any of the others, and much less about intimacy or discipleship. So Pope Levinson begins this section by saying the following. Here is a great new art which has laid hold of all classes of people. Wisdom would seem to direct that the church cooperate in its development and utilize it in every possible way in reaching the unchurched masses. And that's from Orrin G. Cox, who made that statement. And so, what is this great new art? Is what Pope Levinson has to say. The computer, the internet, social media, or maybe years ago, Gutenberg's printing press, telegraph, radio. Actually, the great new art is in this 1916 quotation is film. And so from there, she's going to go into the normal practice of the media model, explaining its biblical, theological, historical, and practical aspects. So, as I mentioned earlier, the media model is going to be the one that has the most amount of reach, and that's really what it's focused on. It's going to say, let's use film, let's use the printing press, let's use social media, let's use Twitter, let's use Facebook, let's use any model that is going to allow us to get to the most amount of people, and let's change as technology is changing so that we are just very quick to embrace it, and almost there's no forethought to the consequences of how the gospel may be modified or changed. It's just more about making sure that we get on board with whatever this message may be. And as Pope Levinson is going to do with all of these models, she's going to say if you use this one kind of as an island, that's when it's got its least effect and actually is less helpful to the church's mission. However, she is going to advocate that there are still some good aspects of this, even if it neglects discipleship or further Christian development in at least some ways in which the other models always have some function in which they can do this really well. And maybe even before we move on, let's contrast it with the revival model. So in the revival model, you're at least going to be in one place, all gathered together. And the goal would be, if you do this well, like Billy Graham used to do, you'd then incorporate those who actually confess faith in Christ into the local church afterwards. So even if the revivalists would not do that work, it would be an expectation that the local congregations would do that work. Where in the media model, you're interacting with the local congregation normally directly, but through social media, and in the same way that it gives this anonymity, so that it's less confrontational. You also have this lack of accountability because there's no physical, tangible church in some aspects. You're just, in a sense, in church online. So there are two main things that you want to keep in mind when you're talking about the media evangelism model. First is that it defines media as any tool that is used for communication. So it doesn't matter if that tool is ancient or modern. If it is a tool beyond just your normal voice and you just find being in the physical presence of the people, but that can create a bridge or a gateway for you to communicate with a broad and a large audience, then that would be considered in their broad definition as media evangelism. And it's going to always focus on seekers and surfers, in the sense of those who are surfing the web, in an effort to engage them in gospel conversations and presentations. And once again, the follow through is not as important as the presentation on the front end. The fact that you can say, okay, everyone has had the opportunity to hear the gospel and to have conversations about it is much more important than whether they end up following through in some sort of tangible way in the main form of the media model. So, does this model have any biblical foundation? And so the proponent's going to argue yes. They're going to go straight to the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20. And particularly, they're going to focus on Jesus' command to go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations. So they're going to emphasize that the media can help you get this sort of global reach. And so she has this quote here, Pope Levising, of a blogger from the Christian Broadcasting Network, which reads, "The internet is just one more tool that many ministries are using to reach the world for Christ. When Christ gave the commandment, go ye into all the world and preach the gospels, the disciples were on foot. There was no television, no radio, no airports, and certainly no internet. What a difference 2,000 years can make, or for that matter, 10 years. Today, more and more people are coming to faith in Christ by logging into the World Wide Web." So then from there, some people are going to get a little more extreme. And Pope Levinson even says even questionable when they try to identify that Christ actually foresaw the internet in Matthew 13:47. So it reads, when he used, or again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. And they're going to say, oh, Christ was talking about a net. We call it the internet. So therefore, this is what Christ was talking about, that one day the internet would exist and we'd be able to catch many fish, just like a fisherman back in his day could catch many fish. We can now catch many people, i.e. them being equated to the fish. Now, once again, I think that that's somewhat of a stretch, but people will say that. So then from there, they're just going to argue that Jesus and Paul, and we'll talk about Jesus first, were two highly successful communicators. So ultimately, when it comes to Jesus, they're just going to say that Jesus was an excellent storyteller. He used parables. He used things that people understood in his time. And they're going to say, okay, these parables and all of this was his ability to use the tools of communication, once again, their broad definition of media. And they're going to argue that Jesus would have undoubtedly have exploited the internet to develop a robust and worldwide social network. So they feel like Jesus wouldn't have had any issue using social media, so why should we today? And then from there, they're going to call Paul the first cyber apostle. So they're going to say he planted churches, which they're going to identify as social networks throughout the Mediterranean world. He communicated with them in letters carried by couriers, and that was the method of communication utilizing the best technology of his time. So they're going to say we should do the same thing in our day. And so then from here, she just gets into the reality of what she calls evangelism. So like internet evangelism or electronic evangelism, evangelism. She has an E and a dash in the word evangelism. And she focuses a lot here on Pope Paul II, which she refers to throughout the chapter, and perhaps we'll bring up some of his thoughts here at the end. So what are the theological foundations of this model? So it's going to focus mostly on the incarnation and on ecclesiology. So the incarnation is just going to be focused on the fact that Christ is the Word of God. He's the divine medium of communication, and he came down to us to continue to communicate God's message to us. And so she has this quote here from some researchers who say there's something deeply incarnational about the digital age. These were three researchers and writers who spoke about the digital communication in the church, and then they put together this interesting statement here that I'll go ahead and read to you. They say, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through papyrus and paper in many different and various ways, but in these last days, his word is shown through the digital realm. God is all about communication. John's gospel opens with the word being present with God and communicating with God. Immediately, the word is associated with life and creativity, the very hallmarks of the digital age, and is transmitted to the world, enshrined among us, and we have seen his glory. That communicated word, the enfleshed word, makes known God, exegetes God to us all. And so for them, that's a strong argument that Christ in and of himself was incarnated. So we need to, in a sense, incarnate the gospel into digital media. Next, they're going to focus on ecclesiology. And specifically, they're going to talk about how the church is a herald and a servant. So we've talked about Dole's models of the church, which is what this book is based on. Models of evangelism. Pope Levinson heavily relies on Dole's models. And so the church as herald and servant, we won't get into much now, but she does point out an interesting point here. She gives the example of Life Church and Church Online, and they are able to reach even people in countries where Christianity is presently illegal and where missionaries are physically prohibited from entering. And so, in that sense, these people wouldn't have the opportunity to go to a brick and mortar church. They can't build them in their country. So if you have other countries, such as the United States, just as an example, that can reach into states like India and Pakistan and actually be sharing the gospel with people who their governments have said it's illegal for them to hear it. Well, this media model, this online model, definitely has a huge advantage there because, in some sense, it can be very low risk to everyone involved, especially if you take into account the modern cell phones. I don't know that there's any country that is banning cell phones or even banning all apps. They may be banning some apps, but if you have, for example, a news app and that news channel also allows someone to talk about the gospel, where you can be watching the news app and also hear about the gospel, hear the gospel message, and be saved and maybe never be able to participate in a church necessarily, but at least you've now heard the message. We can say that maybe even another way is let's say you downloaded an app that was for that church, and that information comes through that app and in a secure way, and you can hear and see what the church is doing and participate in the church from afar as best you can, and still, in a sense, grow some spiritually, but not as well as it would be if the government would allow them to actually build churches in some of those places. So that definitely gives it an advantage, this model advantage over others. Um, all right, and so some of the historical foundations we've already kind of mentioned, but I'll just kind of breeze through these very quickly. You've got Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, which was used by early Christians. I remember when I was studying the Reformation, this was one of the breakthroughs that helped Martin Luther and John Calvin be able to gain so much traction and break away from the Catholic Church, because they were able to print the Bible in German and the language of the people at a massive level in ways that they just were not capable of before. So you can definitely say the Reformation had some sort of tie-in with the printing press for sure. Um, then you have the example here of Florence Crawford, and he was the founder of the Apostolic Faith Mission, which is in Portland, Oregon. And I had never heard about this before reading about it here, but they were printing 150,000 bi-monthly issues and expanding into German and Norwegian areas. And they had the Morning Star, and they had an airplane where they were dropping flyers, and they actually had to make it illegal that you couldn't drop flyers or copies of the Gospel of John from the sky. And then his son, Raymond Crawford, took this over after him. And he had a boat where he was delivering um, pamphlets to people and things like that. And they are, I guess, still in operation. And they print things in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And so definitely this has been utilized to try to help reach as many people as possible. So from there, she just goes in to talk about radio. She talks about how Calvary Episcopal Church on January 2nd in 1921 was the first church to ever be on a religious broadcast on radio. There was also Charles Fuller in the 1940s who had the old-fashioned revival hour. That was a huge hit. She even could have mentioned C.S. Lewis, The Mere Christianity, which is a famous book that many Christians have read today from all denominations, which he also gave in a radio broadcast over the airwaves. And so at the beginning, roughly 456 stations, which was 60% of all radio stations in the United States, were focused on delivering the gospel message in some form or another to as many people as possible. So then from there, you had TV. The example she gives here is Carolyn Coleman, who hosted the Heart to Heart Hour, and then Pat Robertson launched the 700 Club as well. The 700 Club had the ability to reach millions of people. and 24 hours a day. And this would have been the first time that would have been possible as far as through a media platform. So then she gets into just the internet age. So she talks about, which I didn't realize it was this early in the 1996, you had the first church of cyberspace that had already been in running for 4 years prior to that, and this was in the Times magazine was talking about it. In 2004, you had the Church of Fools, sponsored by the British Methodist Church, that had online services for several months, allowing participants to be present through avatars that worshipped and interacted with each other synchronously in a 3D multi-user environment. And then you had the first full church online services through Alpha Church in 1999, which seems to still continue today, and once again had the advantage of having people who are closed off from Christ in China to find Christ awaiting them at Alpha Church. And so Alpha Church offered a way in which they could do communion, baptisms, and offerings, sermons, and singing all through the internet, so that you could, in a sense, participate in church like you would in any other way, shape, or form. So when it comes to evangelism, or once again, internet evangelism, electronic evangelism, it's going to be hard to come up with practical aspects that fit all situations. So she says here in the introduction, she's intentionally made these applications very vague so that they would be relatively affordable for individuals, small groups, and local congregations of any size, and that it would work with any sort of church model, whether it's global or local, and hopefully work with things that may or may not become obsolete, especially even by the time this book was published. Because, for one example, she's going to mention Twitter, and Twitter, in a sense, doesn't really exist the same way that it used to. It's called X today. Though the platform is still roughly the same, the reality is some of these social media things can come and go overnight, especially compared to other things that have happened throughout history. So the first thing she's going to say is that you need to establish a media team. Pope Levinson is going to argue, and I think she does well to do this, that this team should be intergenerational. So you need young people on the team because they're going to be more fluent with the requisite language and have better technology skills normally, because they're going to have first-hand exposure to these. But older people also need to be brought in, because especially if they're retired or they've left the workforce, they might have more time to devote to this. And it's a way in which you can reach the outside of the church by reaching the inside of the church and helping groups of people who normally may not interact to interact with each other. And then she can focus on the fact that they should be talking about the possibilities and the pitfalls, the ethics, the eccentricities of media evangelism, and they should be praying with each other so that they can try to focus on God's guidance leading them to establish a good media presence for the church in ways that will reach people, but also not jeopardize what the church's mission is at the time. And so I think, once again, she gives some helpful context for how you can bring those two groups together to also, in a sense, create a small group over how how the church should be presented on the internet. So next she's going to say focus on a receptive audience. So here, Pope Levinson is trying to say you need to narrow your focus. If your church was going to win everyone in the world and be the only church in the world, then there's a certain sense where you wouldn't have these other local congregations. And so if God does expect there to be multiple churches and multiple locations, which I don't think any church would disagree with, even a pastor who's going to have multi-campuses does this for a particular purpose, then that means you have a target group out there that you can use this media to reach. And so you need to be asking specific questions about exactly how are you going to tailor the gospel message, not modify it or jeopardize it, but tailor it to actually reach the individual people that you want to come. And she's going to even argue that you potentially could just have particular members on the media team be reaching out to individuals in some sort of personal way through the internet, obviously, but in a more personal way that can help you set up things for um, offline conversations, which she's going to give some advice for later. And so she kind of has these sort of questions that you should be asking. So she says, once your audience is selected, you want to find out as much information as you can about them. Do they read newspaper or magazines? Do they prefer books? And if so, what genre? Do they watch certain TV channels or Netflix shows? Do they listen to certain radio programs or podcasts? What social media platforms do they use? The goal of these research questions is to develop an actual persona for the audience and then keep this persona always in mind as the team creates and disseminates media content. So next, she says, choose your media. So she's going to say the information you gathered from step 2 about your receptive audience should influence the exact media that you're going to choose. And so she's going to say that you probably don't want to just have 100% evangelistic media post, but instead stories and topics, music, art, drama, short reflections, things like that that are going to have some sort of theological reflections on them that you can point people to Christ through those sorts of things. And you could also move from there to actually interact with their posts. So if you say, okay, our target audience is all related to a particular new book that has come out, maybe we could say something like the Hunger Games, maybe you'd actually interact with a Hunger Games reading group and try to explain some theological and godly insights from that particular book and that genre of books, or recommend maybe a more Christian book related to that genre of books. So then from there, she's going to get into the different options that you could have. So you can have a website and focusing on just developing that website in such a way that people will want to interact with it when it comes to your church. Facebook, Twitter, which once again is now known as X, YouTube, and Instagram and Snapchat. And once again, she goes into individual ways in which you can use each of these to try to help your church, but we won't go into all of those now. And ultimately, she's going to say that you need to have done all of this well enough to cultivate relationships online that would also have some fruit offline. So she's going to say the majority of spiritual conversations, 92%, still take place in person, according to the Barna Group, while only half as many happen via social media. More telling is the report that 73% of conversations that led to a major life change happen in person. Barna also found that many internet users simultaneously use media platforms such as Facebook and in-person conversations. This fusion of offline and online, what is referred to as hybridy, has become the norm for most Americans. Interactions online shape offline experiences, Gornell explains, and offline communication and practice shape people's online engagement. The takeaway of this observation is that media evangelism should not be approached as a surrogate or substitute for face-to-face relationships. Instead, it can be utilized to initiate and develop them. So what is the overall appraisal of evangelism or electronic evangelism, media evangelism? Once again, it can reach places where you wouldn't normally be able to reach. If you put something out there on the internet, you never know who's going to run across it. And it's always going to be less threatening to anyone who's seeking out Christ. They'll have time to get the information, reflect on it, and have time to respond if they so choose when it comes to it, especially if it's something hard. So like if you're going to condemn something in society, it's easier for someone to watch that online, be mad about it, at their house and not, curse you to your face. Maybe think about it some and then go like, right, maybe they've got some practical advice and maybe I need to go to that church and check it out. But the downside of that as well is that it's time consuming. It's not seasonal. It's something you have to keep feeding the beast, is how she describes it over and over again. It's crowded. There's plenty of churches and plenty of people doing it. And so you can just almost get caught up and spending a lot of time and energy and not getting really any results if you don't do it well. As we use today, some things are going to go viral at some point and some other things won't be. And sometimes you'll have even better content and that just gets overshadowed because yours just didn't go viral for whatever reason. She points out here that there are more people who want a mobile phone in the world than a toothbrush. And then I guess there was a survey if they were asked if they either wanted a phone or a toothbrush, and more people chose a mobile phone. And once again, most people don't have good discernment when it comes to how they're going to use this technology. From there, you also then have the issue of this lack of accountability. Because if people are online, are they, in a sense, catfishing you? Are they really the person that they're claiming they're being? Are they actually changing their life? Are they saying one thing while they're on the internet and being someone else when they're not on the internet? Are you trying, in a sense, giving them this sort of feel-good message where they feel like they have, in a sense, earned their salvation because they've attended a church service, but then they go out and live like the world afterwards? And in some ways, you can't really control that. But that's definitely much harder to do when you're actually living life together in a local congregation. And so it's got its ups and got its downs, just like all of the rest of them. But definitely this one has the potential to have much more reach than any of the other models.